Chapter 9. Mira, Survival. The crowd's roar echoed through the stone corridors like thunder as the Zabrak fighter emerged from the shadowed depths of the arena's underground holds. She was a magnificent specimen, muscular and lean, her body carved from years of brutal training and survival. Leather shoulder pads sat across her broad frame, complemented by shin guards and a battle skirt that moved with deadly grace. Leather wristbands wound up her forearms, dotted with scales of polished metal that caught the arena's harsh light. Her breastplate, studded with 2 parallel rows of iron rivets, protected her vital organs while leaving her scarred back exposed, except for the crossing straps that held her armor in place. But it was her face that truly commanded attention, horns circling her head like a crown of bone, her features set with calm, controlled rage. This wasn't her first time in the arena, but she was clearly amped up, ready to unleash violence. They called her Samsima, or in her tongue, Tempest. Mira was thankful that for today she would be fighting at her side. The games in the circle followed a brutal but varied format, sometimes 2 fighters from one ludus against 2 from a competing stable, sometimes 4 on 4, and occasionally the cruel spectacle of 3 against 1. Today it would be 3 on 3. Though the battles were not officially to the death, many ended that way regardless. Others left combatants maimed or crippled, as Mira had nearly been during her first terrifying appearance in the circle. When she had first arrived at what the trainers referred to affectionately as the training center, she'd been issued new clothing, if the scant leather coverings could be called such. The first 2 days had been nothing but physical evaluation. How far could they run? How much weight could they lift? How long could they endure pain? Challenge after grueling challenge, while the trainers at the ludus took copious notes on their digipads, cataloguing each slave's potential value. On the 3rd day, they were given woven baskets and ordered to load them with stones, then carry the crushing weight on their backs up the steep mountain that cast its shadow over the ludus compound. Run until you can run no more, the trainers commanded with cold efficiency. All 30 female gladiators began the ascent, but slowly, inevitably, each would reach her breaking point and collapse to the rocky ground, and there they were to stay. Those were the instructions. When the last runner finally stumbled and fell, the trainers took precise readings of each trainee's location on the mountainside. Of the 10 who had travelled the least distance, those who had quit toward the bottom of the mountain, 5 were executed on the spot, their bodies left as carrion for the mountain scavengers. The other 5 were dragged away, presumably destined for other uses by the slave masters. The next 10 survivors had their hair shorn, not completely, but enough so that each trainee's neck was clearly visible, marking them as the middle tier of this deadly hierarchy. The final group, of which Mira had finished 3rd, were brought to a storage room where they could choose better coverings, no doubt stripped from losing gladiators now long dead, judging from the stench and blood-stained leather that clung to every piece. From that day forward, they were permitted to practice with real weapons instead of the wooden staves and blunted swords of the condemned. 4 types of weapons were assigned to fighters in the circle. There was the long staff, a cruel thing with a sharp metal tip at one end and a hooked blade at the other. The sword and shield combination offered both offense and defense. The arm blades were perhaps the most vicious, padded guards that fitted over the forearms, each sporting long, scythe-like blades that turned the fighter's arms into instruments of death. Finally, there was the warhammer with its oversized, bone-crushing head. Mira had been assigned the arm blades. She would have preferred the sword. When weapons training began on the 4th day, Mira excelled, at first. She had been an Ashlar warrior for over a decade, after all. Though the arm blades were foreign to her, her tactical knowledge and combat experience proved sufficient against most of her training partners. But there were 3 fighters who exposed a difficult truth. She had relied on the Force far more than she'd ever realized. With the Force-suppressing collar locked around her throat, cutting her off from the living cosmic energy that had been her constant companion, she was forced to rely on visual cues, the twitch of a muscle, the unconscious habits of her opponents, the subtle shifts in stance that telegraphed an attack. No longer could she use the force to push or pull an enemy off balance, or send objects hurtling through the air as weapons. Now it was just her raw battle skills and these new, deadly implements that would determine whether she lived or died. And so far, somehow, she had survived. Survived for this, to put her life on the line for the amusement of bloodthirsty strangers. The crowd erupted again as the Zabrak's opponent entered the circle directly across from her. A short Shistavanen emerged from the shadows, her wolfish features set in predatory focus. Leather coverings wrapped her furred chest and torso, though they did little to conceal the natural weapons she bore, gleaming fangs and razor-sharp claws that caught the arena's harsh light. Still, her assigned weapon was the long staff, same as her opponent. The spectators howled their approval at the cruel joke of forcing a natural predator to rely on manufactured steel. Next came Mira's turn. A Gamorrean guard drove the butt of an electrobaton into her back, the shock sending lightning through her muscles as he forced her into the blazing light of the circle. The crowd's cheer was appreciative but measured. They had seen her perform once before, but she was not yet a proven favourite. The arena's heat hit her like a physical wall, the sand beneath her feet still stained dark from previous contests. Above, the tiered seating rose like the maw of some ancient beast, packed with faces hungry for violence and spectacle. Her opponent emerged from the opposite tunnel, and Mira read her story in a single glance. Human, probably no more than 18 standard years, with the lean desperation of someone who had known hunger intimately. Her movements carried the awkward uncertainty of the recently enslaved, likely sold by a family too poor to feed another mouth, or perhaps taken in a debt raid on some forgotten outer rim world. The sword she carried seemed almost too heavy for her slight frame, though the small buckler strapped to her other arm appeared manageable enough. Still, Mira knew better than to mistake inexperience for weakness. Desperation made fighters dangerous in ways training never could. Next, to the crowd's absolute delight, a young female Wookiee from Mira's own Ludus stepped into the blazing arena. Trekker, one of the 3 fighters who had consistently tested Mira's skills to their absolute limit during training. The long staff in her massive hands looked like little more than a carved branch, almost comically small against her towering frame. Though not yet a fully matured adult of her species, she still stood well over 2 meters tall and possessed the raw strength of 4 humans. The arena floor seemed to vibrate with each of her footsteps as she took her position, her deep growl of acknowledgement rumbling through the stone like distant thunder. As if to answer Trekker's rumbling growl, the final combatant stepped into the blazing light. A Trandoshan warrior emerged, covered in full leather guards that had been scarred and restitched countless times. The reptilian fighter was tall and powerfully built, her scaled frame substantial enough that she would not be entirely dwarfed by the young Wookiee. She raised both arms in salute to the crowd, brandishing sword and shield with the fluid confidence of a seasoned killer. This one was no newcomer to the circle, Mira thought grimly. The countless scars that crisscrossed her visible scales, the way she savoured the crowd's attention, the methodical manner in which she tested her weapon's balance, all spoke of considerable time spent in this arena of death. It was clear that Trekker's raw strength would not guarantee victory this day. The Trandoshan slowly rotated in place, deliberately rattling her weapons together in a rhythmic display that sent the crowd into a frenzy. She knew exactly how to work the spectators, how to build their bloodlust to a fever pitch. Her reptilian eyes swept the stands with cold calculation, reading the crowd's hunger like a hunter reads tracks in the wilderness. All 6 combatants walked toward the center of the arena as the Shagrian announcer raised his arms, his blue-skinned form commanding attention as he hushed the roaring crowd. "Welcome one and all," he began, his voice amplified by hidden speakers that sent his words reverberating through the stone amphitheater. "To witness death dance with destiny in the circles." The crowd, already on their feet, erupted in thunderous applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient structure. Above the combatants, the packed seating stretched upward in endless rows, filled with faces hungry to witness the aggression. Merchants and smugglers, slavers and crime lords, and commoners alike, all united in their thirst for the battle sport that had made Jumalak Okona, or Okona as it was commonly known, legendary across the Outer Rim and beyond. This world had become synonymous with gladiatorial combat, the way other planets were known for their spice or their shipyards. And to witness this captivating contest of courage, the announcer continued, his voice dripping with theatrical reverence, we are honoured by the presence of the noble Bogan, the Archon of Morvain, High Lord Salentis. From the shaded luxury box high above the arena floor, Salentis rose from his ornate seat. He was draped entirely in black, leather armour beneath flowing robes, boots and gloves that seemed to drink in the harsh arena light. His slick black hair was pulled back severely, framing dark eyes that held the cold calculation of a predator. As he waved to the crowd with theatrical grace, clasping his hands together in acknowledgement of their adulation, his personal guard remained motionless behind him. Each guardsman was clearly force-sensitive, their lightsabers hanging at their sides like promises of swift death to any who would threaten their master. Mira instinctively turned away, as if the simple gesture could somehow obscure her appearance beyond recognition. It was a natural reaction when in the presence of another force wielder, the desperate hope of going undetected. But the dampening collar around her throat ensured that she was invisible to Salentis's supernatural senses. That, combined with her matted, unkempt hair and the layers of sweat-caked dirt that covered her face and body, made Mira look like anything but an Ashlar warrior of one of the great houses. A Bogan, she thought bitterly. Of course, they feed off the suffering of others. She had seen it firsthand. Bogan forces separating mothers from children as they processed captives for the brutal mines of Dragonot. She had witnessed them cut down elderly civilians, harmless non-combatants, who posed no threat beyond existing in the path of their conquest. It wasn't enough for the Bogan to simply embrace the dark side's raw emotions. They needed to feast on the terror, helplessness, and despair of others like parasites feeding on pain. Salentis's presence at such a contest made perfect sense to her. Where better to gorge himself on suffering of others than an arena built for it? "And now," the announcer bellowed, his voice reaching a fever pitch, "we begin the battle with the sound of the horn." A short, rotund man approached a massive mounted horn carved from the cheekbone of a reek, one of the great beasts rumoured to roam some far-flung world that weary travellers called Geonosis, and pressed it to his lips. He blew with all his might, and a horrible sound rang out, low, resonant, and primal. The sound seemed to awaken something savage in the crowd's collective consciousness. The spectacle had begun. The young human rushed at Mira with a scream that tried to disguise terror as courage. As they clashed, the girl slashed wildly and without control, her sword cutting desperate arcs through the air. Mira used both arm blades defensively, blocking and deflecting the frenzied assault with fluid efficiency. She's strong, Mira thought grimly. I'll give her that. Mira moved in a defensive circle, refusing to attack her desperate opponent. The crowd, sensing the lack of bloodshed, began to voice their displeasure with jeers and catcalls that echoed through the stone amphitheatre. Meanwhile, Trekar and the Trandoshan, whose name could only be pronounced in the common tongue as Park, met in the centre and began circling each other with predatory caution. Park intermittently clanged her sword against her shield in a rhythmic display of intimidation, punctuating each strike with a threatening hiss that revealed rows of razor-sharp teeth. Trekar lunged forward several times, attempting to spear Park in the head or midsection, using techniques passed down through generations, skills taught by the first Wookiee immigrants who had brought their hunting methods from their far-flung homeworld to this sector. But Park proved skilled, using sword and shield in perfect coordination to deflect each incoming thrust. Mira caught the exchange from the corner of her eye, her tactical mind automatically analyzing the flow of combat. Traker was one of the few gladiators she had actually spoken to during training, one of the rare souls with whom she had begun to build some tentative connection. In training sessions, Traker's greatest weakness had always been impatience, apparently a common trait among her species. The young Wookiee would grow frustrated with prolonged combat and rush to finish fights, often resulting in opponents outmaneuvering her and landing the winning blow. Mira had exploited this weakness several times herself before her mentoring instincts overcame competitive advantage, and she had begun sharing tactical observations with her tall, hairy teammate. "Take your time," Mira thought desperately, careful not to let the words slip and distract the young Wookiee. "There's no rush. Be patient." To her right, Tempest was living up to her arena name, spinning and twirling her staff in dazzling patterns that kept the Shistavanen, who Mira would later learn was called Harja, at a respectful distance. Mira refocused on her own precarious situation. While Mira couldn't care less about pleasing the bloodthirsty crowd, the young woman facing her clearly craved their approval. She needed to win at all costs. Girl, as her teammates called the lowest-ranking member of their group of 10, understood that victory meant rendering her opponent unconscious, incapacitated, or dead. With determination not just to survive but win etched into every line of her face, she launched another vicious assault of flailing strikes against Mira. But this time, she kicked sand toward Mira's face, sending a cloud of grit and dust to choke and blind her. Mira's first instinct was to reach out through the force, to feel the coming onslaught through the darkness and sense the movement, direction, and intent of her attacker. But the collar's presence crashed back into her consciousness like a physical blow, and she quickly realized that only her hearing could save her now. Losing her sight as well as the force compelled Mira to concentrate entirely on her hearing. With the focus of a trained Ashlar warrior, she could discern the direction and speed of each attack by listening to the frequency and rhythm of footsteps in the sand. Mira heard the pattern and length of the girl's stride alter, which could only be caused by her raising her weapon overhead. Mira reacted, lifting both arm blades above her head, catching the descending blow with a metallic clang that rang across the arena. She slid her blades down to the base of the sword, scissoring the weapon near its hilt, then used the trapped blade to yank her opponent closer. She heard the girl's sharp gasp of surprise and drove her forehead forward in a devastating headbutt. The impact was so forceful that the girl released her sword and stumbled backward, crashing onto the sand. Mira shook her head and blinked rapidly, attempting to clear her vision. She wiped her face and eyes with the rags wrapped around one arm guard, cloth originally meant to secure the armor tighter to her forearm, but now serving as her salvation. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of voices. Though their words were a jumbled mixture of languages and dialects, each spectator so caught up in the contest that they abandoned the common tongue. Mira understood exactly what they wanted. Even Lord Salentis took interest, sensing the proximity of death like a predator scenting blood. He rose from his seat, his dark eyes fixed on the arena floor. The girl glanced desperately at her sword, which lay partially buried in the sand several meters behind Mira, then back at her armed opponent. She pushed herself upright and made a frantic dash for the weapon in a final suicidal attempt to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. As she sprinted toward her sword in a desperate charge, the crowd fully expected to see the unarmed fighter with only a small shield cut down by the lethal arm blades. Instead, they watched in stunned surprise as Mira simply slammed her shoulder into the girl mid-stride, sending her sprawling back onto the sand. The jeers and boos came fast and furious, a wave of displeasure that crashed over the arena like a physical force. Then, to her left, a cry of anguish pierced the air, followed by the crowd's bloodthirsty roar. Mira spun to see Traker on her knees, clutching her thigh in obvious agony. The young Wookiee had grown impatient, just as Mira had feared, and hurled her staff like a spear with such tremendous force that it would have ended the fight instantly, had it found its mark. But Park had dodged the desperate attack, and now, with Trekker weaponless and vulnerable, the Trandoshan had opened a deep gash across the Wookiee's thigh. Mira watched in horror as Trekker struggled to stand, tried to evade the follow-up strikes, but received another vicious slash, then another. Pack was toying with her wounded prey the way a predator plays with a dying animal, drawing out the suffering for the crowd's twisted entertainment. The rules of the games existed solely to maximize excitement and increase the wagering among spectators. One could bet on which team would emerge victorious, which individual fighter would survive, how many, if any, would die. The betting was as extensive as it was macabre. One such rule stated that in multi-contestant battles, a fighter could only assist a teammate against their opponent if they had killed, not merely incapacitated or rendered unconscious, their own foe. Trekker was in mortal danger and desperately needed Mira's help. But hesitation, born from her deepest beliefs and code of ethics as an Ashlar leader, held her frozen in place. Yes, she had fought and killed before, many times, but always with purpose, to protect the innocent, to defend the helpless, to preserve life rather than destroy it. Never from hatred, never for sport, never for the bloodthirsty entertainment of strangers who bet on suffering like others wagered on racing pods. The weight of choice crushed down on her as she looked back at the girl lying helpless in the sand. Young, desperate, probably sold into this nightmare through no fault of her own. To kill her would be murder, but to let Trekker die would be a betrayal of the budding connection, a promising prospect of future loyalty and friendship, of everything that made life worth preserving in the first place. Mira's hesitation caused irritation high above the arena. Salentis slammed his fists on the ledge of his luxury box, the impact reverberating through the ancient stone. "No!" he shrieked, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur like a blade through silk. He motioned with theatrical fury, and one of his personal guards leaped from his perch down to the arena floor, igniting his crimson lightsaber on the way down. The blade's malevolent glow painted the sand in shades of blood and shadow. The crowd gasped as one, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the very air from the arena. Mira was jolted from the moral conflict that had left her paralyzed in a dazed state, her mind reeling between duty and conscience. The guardsman's visored helmet gleamed like polished obsidian as he walked with lethal purpose toward the girl, each step deliberate and measured. The red lightsaber hummed with menace, casting dancing shadows across the arena walls. Mira rushed to intercept the Bogan enforcer, her boots kicking up clouds of sand as she sprinted past the fallen girl, raising her right arm blade, while releasing a primal battle cry that tore from her throat like the roar of some caged beast finally unleashed. But before she could close even half the distance, the guardsman raised his free hand with casual indifference. The force struck her like an invisible battering ram, launching her meters through the air in a graceful, helpless arc. Mira crashed hard onto her back, the impact driving every molecule of air from her lungs as pain exploded through her spine. She gasped desperately, her chest spasming as she fought for breath, watching in horror as the Bogan approached the girl. The young woman scrambled backward like a wounded crab, terror written across her dirt-streaked face. In desperation, she raised one trembling hand, as if that pitiful gesture could somehow deflect the crimson death that approached. The guardsman lifted his lightsaber with ceremonial precision, then brought it down in one swift final stroke. Mira tried to scream no, but could only manage a strangled gasp, her lungs still empty from the devastating impact. Those in the crowd who witnessed the execution fell into stunned silence. They had never seen such an incursion before, the sacred rules of the circle violated by outside intervention. Uncertainty rippled through the stands like a contagion. They were not sure whether to applaud this display of absolute power or cry out in outrage at the breach of tradition. The guardsman turned his attention to Mira and took 2 measured steps before Salentis raised his hand, silently communicating through the force that he was satisfied with the execution he had orchestrated. The weight of realization crashed down on her like a collapsing building. Her hesitation, that split second of moral paralysis when she had refused to kill an innocent girl, had sealed that same girl's fate more surely than any blade. The cruel reality of the arena had played out exactly as designed. Mercy had been rewarded with murder, compassion with catastrophe. This was the lesson Salentis had orchestrated from his luxury box, and Mira understood it with sickening clarity. Sometimes doing what felt right, what aligned with every principle the Ashlar held sacred, still led to horror beyond imagination. The girl would have died either way, by Mira's hand in honorable combat, or by a Bogan executioner's blade as punishment for Mira's righteousness. But knowing that didn't ease the crushing guilt that settled into her bones like poison. She had learned something today that would follow her into every battle, every decision, every quiet moment for the rest of her life. In a galaxy ruled by those who fed on suffering, even virtue could become a weapon turned against the innocent. It was a truth too terrible for the Ashlar teachings to prepare her for, and too real to ever forget. Mira lay shocked on the arena sand, holding back tears of grief and rage that threatened to overwhelm her completely. She drew in her first shuddering breath, then another, and as she struggled to her feet, she took one last anguished glance at the girl's still form before turning her attention to Park and Traker. Traker was barely standing, hunched over and breathing in ragged gasps, held upright only by sheer Wookiee will and stubborn pride. Multiple vicious slashes crisscrossed her massive frame, dark blood matting her fur. She tried one last time to assume a defensive stance, but her strength finally failed her. The young Wookiee collapsed to the ground, still breathing, but fading fast. Mira rushed across the arena, though the distance felt endless now, as if she were struggling through quicksand while time itself conspired against her. No, no, no! Mira's internal protest finally broke her silence and found voice as desperation clawed at her throat. No! She screamed at Pac, who was taking her time walking toward the fallen Wookiee, drawing out every moment to extract maximum agony from both her dying prey and her would-be rescuer. Just as Mira reached the pair, Pac raised her sword with theatrical flourish, playing to the bloodthirsty crowd one final time, and ended the Wookiee's life. No! Mira cried aloud as she brought her arm blade crashing down on Pac's buckler shield. Like a berserker possessed by fury, she began to rage wildly against the Trandoshan, expending all her strength in a desperate attempt at revenge, exactly as Pac had planned. Across the arena, the battle between the Zabrak and SWTOR raged on. To the casual observer, Samsima the Tempest and Harja seemed to be evenly matched. But to those with a keen eye for combat, it was clear that the Tempest displayed superior skill with the staff, as well as technical close-quarters techniques. She spun the staff from one position to another, one stance flowing into the next with fluid grace, treating the weapon not merely as a device to be thrust or swung for damage, but as an extension of her very being. Many a war prisoner ended up in the circles. They were prized by the arena masters for their prior training and experience, their courage and tactical knowledge forged in real battles where defeat meant death rather than mere entertainment. It would not be difficult to imagine Samsima at one time leading her own forces against an enemy in some distant campaign, a campaign that had ultimately ended in capture rather than victory, transforming a battlefield commander into arena fodder. What caused the uninitiated to view the scales of conflict as equal was the sheer instinctive speed and predatory reflexes of the SWTOR adversary. Where Samsima relied on technique, Harja depended on the raw gifts of her species, lightning-fast reactions and natural weapons that had evolved over millennia. Both fighters had attacked and defended countless times since the Horn's first blast, their battle becoming a relentless exchange of violence. When Samsima launched a series of rapid thrusts, Harja would counter with a flurry of slashes and lunges. When Harja pressed forward with feral aggression, Samsima would flow backward, her staff creating defensive patterns that turned aside the SWTOR's weapon. The combat had been almost non-stop, and both combatants were beginning to show signs of fatigue, their movements slightly slower, their breathing more labored, sweat glistening on fur and tattooed skin alike. Samsima, gripping her staff dead center, began to twirl the weapon in a complex pattern before smoothly sliding it under her arm and securing it against her torso, the classic ready position of a master staff fighter. With her arm clamped down to hold the staff in place, she slowly, carefully stepped one leg across the other, moving in a semicircle around her foe like a hunting nexu circling its quarry. Haja slowly turned to track her opponent's movement, muscles coiled and ready. Then, with explosive force, she crouched low and lunged several meters at Samsima, raising her staff high overhead in a devastating two-handed grip, preparing to bring the weapon crashing down with bone-crushing force. Samsima stepped aside, with dancer-like grace, as she released her staff from under her arm, allowing the weapon to arc through the air in front of her. The metal-tipped weapon struck Haja's descending staff with devastating precision, snapping the weapon cleanly in two. Haja landed hard, spun around, and stared at the broken half-staff in her hand. With explosive fury, she hurled the useless weapon to the ground, her wolfish features contorting with rage and disgust. Her entire posture screamed defiance. These pathetic rules, these inferior tools, where I come from, there are no constraints on the hunt. No artificial weapons to fail you when death comes calling. My people were apex predators long before we ever touched manufactured steel, and it's time to remember what that means. With primal ferocity written in every line of her body, she lunged towards Samsima with jaws agape, abandoning all pretense of civilized combat for the raw savagery that had kept her ancestors alive for millennia. The force of impact knocked both fighters to the ground, with Samsima's intact staff lodged firmly between Haja's snapping jaws, the only barrier between razor-sharp teeth and her vulnerable throat. Samsima kept the staff wedged in place with straightened, straining arms while Haja clawed frantically at the leather armor, searching desperately for flesh to tear into. Samsima arched her back with all her might, using one powerful leg combined with centrifugal force to launch her adversary up, over, and off of her in a display of pure athleticism. Both fighters scrambled back to their feet with desperate urgency. As Haja sprang forward in another savage lunge, Samsima spun behind her and wrapped both arms around the Shistovanan's throat in a brutal chokehold. The wolfish combatant, feeling her air supply being cut off, began clawing frantically at Samsima's leather forearm guards in a desperate bid for freedom, her claws tearing through the protective covering and reaching dangerously close to the vulnerable flesh beneath. But Samsima displayed the incredible strength and flexibility that had made her a champion, using her powerful legs to methodically trap first one of the desperate Shistovanan's clawed arm, then the other. With her left leg wrapped around her opponent's left arm and her right leg securing the opposite limb, she pinned both deadly weapons harmlessly against her opponent's sides while maintaining the stranglehold, a feat of raw physical power that spoke to the brutal conditioning of the arena's elite fighters. Samsima held on tenaciously, tightening her stranglehold as Haja struggled violently to escape before losing consciousness. At least twice, Samsima felt her grip slipping on the sweat-drenched fur, a loosening that would surely give Haja the opportunity to breathe again, or worse, escape the constricting body hold entirely. But slowly, inexorably, with oxygen and blood flow cut off from her brain, Haja slipped into merciful unconsciousness. Once her opponent was completely still, Samsima released her grip and pushed the limp form to the side. She lay flat on her back, chest heaving as she drew in much-needed air. As the roar of the crowd slowly penetrated the silent chamber of concentration that Samsima had locked herself within for the duration of battle, she rose to her feet and headed toward Mira and Pak, gaining momentum with each deliberate step. She could see that Mira had exhausted herself in her berserker assault, and now faced her opponent with arms lowered at her sides, bent slightly at the waist, her chest rising and falling rapidly in desperate gulps for oxygen. But when Samsima reached the combatants with her staff positioned to join the fray, Mira turned and extended her hand. A gesture that, combined with the fierce glare in her eyes, could only mean one thing. This battle was hers and hers alone. Samsima slowed to a stop, and only when Mira was certain that her comrade would under no circumstances interfere did she turn her attention back to Park, who hissed with predatory satisfaction and began circling her like a hunting Vornska. If Pak thought that her adversary's energy was completely spent, she would be utterly wrong. Mira's initial surge of attacks had been fueled by pure emotion. Rage, anger, grief, and frustration, all mixed into a potent concoction that had raised her adrenaline to unnatural heights. But as that chemical rush began to ebb, years of training and experience as an Ashla elite commander took over. She steadied her mind with slow, methodical breathing, finding her center in the eye of the storm. Though she could no longer wield the force through conscious effort, a profound truth crystallized in her mind with startling clarity. She had been one with the force, and it had been one with her, not as master and tool, but as partners in an eternal dance. The force had always been with her, flowing through every cell, every thought, every heartbeat. She had never truly understood this until losing the ability to command it. "The force is with me," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of revelation. "I am one with the force." This was truth. She knew it in her soul, felt it resonate in her bones like the echo of a temple bell. For so many years, she had thought of the force as a tool to be wielded, a power to be commanded. Only now did she understand it as a living presence, not something that worked for her, but something that existed alongside her, within her, as much a part of her being as her own heartbeat. She spoke the words again as she moved slowly and deliberately into a modified Makashi stance. The elegant dueling form she had mastered with her lightsaber, now adapted to the deadly arm blades that had become extensions of her will. She repeated herself in an undertone, but with more conviction. "The force is with me. I am one with the force." Knowing they were now the center of attention, Park began to play to the crowd like a courtesan working a noble's feast. She lunged toward Mira with theatrical flourishes before launching into spinning swordplay. Leaping strikes and elaborate footwork meant as much for misdirection as entertainment. Mira, centered and calm as still water, seemed to read the very language of combat itself. Each movement, each shift of weight, each micro-expression on Park's reptilian features revealed what would come next, as if invisible lines traced themselves across her vision, mapping every possible angle of attack, every defensive opening, every path her enemy's blade might take through the air. So much so that with each pass, Mira's blades found flesh. A slice across the forearm, a shallow cut along the ribs, another nick above the collarbone. Avoid, evade, then deliver another surgical wound. Precise cuts that every spectator knew could have opened arteries had Mira willed it so. She was a master craftsman at work, and Pak was merely the canvas. The realization dawned on the Trandoshan like ice water in her veins. She was being played with, like a toy, dissected alive for the crowd's amusement. Reptilian fury kindled behind her yellow eyes as she abandoned theatrical flourishes for the brutal efficiency of a cornered beast. Her attacks became killing strikes, overhand cuts meant to cleave bone, thrusts aimed at the heart. Each missed its mark by the width of a vibroblade. Each was punished by another wound, as if her enemy sought to kill her with 1,000 tiny deaths. Mira found herself savoring each moment of Park's humiliation, drawing out the suffering both mental and physical like vintage wine from an ancient cask. But all hunts must end, and the time had come to finish this predator who had murdered her comrade for sport. Park swung her sword in a wild, desperate arc, the kind of attack that screamed of panic and exhaustion. It was exactly the opening Mira had been orchestrating for the past 5 minutes. She caught the blade between her arm blades like a vice, twisted, and threw the attacking arm wide, leaving Park's torso completely exposed. Mira's heel drove into the Trandoshan's sternum with the concentrated force of 1,000 heartbreaks. lifting her completely off the ground and hurling her through the air like a child's doll. The wet crack of breaking ribs echoed even over the crowd's roar. Park crashed hard into the sand, rolling several meters before coming to rest in a crumpled heap. Before she could draw a rattling breath, Mira was upon her again. Another devastating kick that turned ribs to splinters and sent the Trandoshan tumbling across the arena floor like a broken marionette. Somehow, through sheer reptilian stubbornness, Park struggled to her knees. Her breathing came in wet, labored gasps that spoke of punctured lungs. Above her, Mira stood silhouetted against sunlight, streaming filtered into the arena like death's own shadow, arm blades gleaming with fresh blood. Park raised her weapons in a final, pathetic defensive gesture, buckler and sword trembling in her scaled hands, knowing it would not be enough. Mira paused, and in that crystalline moment, she understood something profound about power. This was what the Bogan craved. Not just victory, but the exquisite moment when your enemy realized their absolute helplessness. She could taste Park's bitter defeat like copper on her tongue, could feel the waves of shame rolling off the Trandoshan like heat from a forge. For just an instant, she understood why beings like SWTOR chose the path of darkness. The crowd sensed the approaching climax and began to bay like a pack of Corellian hounds scenting wounded prey. Thousands of voices merged into a primal roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient amphitheater. High above in his luxury box, SWTOR rose from his throne-like seat, dark eyes blazing with an hunger that had nothing to do with mere entertainment. His pale hands moved in unconscious mirror of Mira's stance. Fingers curled as if gripping invisible arm blades. His body swaying with each of her movements, swept up in the deadly choreography below. This was the moment the crowd had paid to witness. Revenge served with fateful precision. The finale to an epic written in sweat and scored by screams. Mira brought both arm blades down simultaneously, like twin guillotines falling in perfect, terrible synchronization. The crowd's roar died to sudden, shocked silence as Park's weapons tumbled to the stained sand, buckler and sword still clutched in the death grip of severed hands. Then the silence shattered like glass. The crowd erupted in a sound that might have been heard in orbit. Thousands of voices screaming approval, bloodlust and vicarious satisfaction. SWTOR threw back his head and laughed with the pure joy of a predator gorging on pain. Park's hiss of agony was lost in the cacophony as she stared at the ruins of her wrists. Park was not dead, but perhaps that was a crueler fate. Without hands to grip the weapons that defined a gladiator's existence, what was she now? A broken thing, reduced to crawling in the sand while her life's blood painted abstract patterns in the dirt. Mira had not merely destroyed her physically, she had obliterated everything that made Park who she was. In the merciless currency of the arena, identity and ability were one and the same, and Mira had rendered her bankrupt in both. That was enough. That was justice. Mira turned and walked away without a backward glance, leaving the Trandoshan to contemplate the final lesson of the arena. That cruelty, like all debts, must eventually be paid in full.